Hello.
Hello, Richard.
Kari. Hello, dear man.
Hello, Richard, and hello, everyone. I think we're ready to go. Welcome to this special Booktopia event. My name is Kari Gislason. I'm a writer and an academic, and I've written 4 books, most recently The Sorrow Stone. I teach creative writing and literary studies at QUT. And today it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with broadcaster and writer Richard Fidler. Richard is very well known and loved for his interviews on ABC Radio. He is the author of the best-selling book Ghost Empire, a history of the lost civilization of Byzantium. He's also the co-author with me of Sagaland, the story of the sagas of Iceland, as well as The Golden Maze, a biography of Prague. And his latest work, and the one we'll be discussing today, is the Book of Roads and Kingdoms. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend this to any First Nations people listening. Richard, your new book is about Islam's golden age. So I wondered whether we could begin by describing what that means and how that term is used. What do people mean when they talk about this golden age of Islam?
Kari, this was an era when the Abbasid Empire, based around the fabled city of Baghdad, became the largest empire the world had ever seen up until that point. Larger than the Roman Empire at its fullest extent. It was an empire that ranged from North Africa all the way to India. And its caliphs, who were the successors of the Prophet Muhammad, lived in a state of exceptional splendor. Even by any standards of the ancient and medieval world, they lived in extraordinary splendor in this purpose-built utopian city of Baghdad. Baghdad was fabled for its beauty and its design. It was designed by the Caliph Mansur, who was a fan of the mathematician Euclid, and so he designed it as a disc with these roads leading out on the cardinal points of the compass that led out from Baghdad in Mesopotamia to the furthest points across the known world, as they were. And as such, Baghdad found itself in Mesopotamia, not coincidentally, of course, but in Mesopotamia at the crossroads of the whole world. There were roads that led to east to China, southeast to India and Sri Lanka, southwest down through Basra down to the kingdoms of East Africa, and west into Western Europe to Constantinople and into Western Europe. And so it was the center of all this trade and exchange of ideas, and it was unspeakably wealthy and fabulous. This is the age that's commemorated in the 1001 Nights. Tales were often given as children, this fabled era of Baghdad, where a place full of stunning beauty, invention, scholarly inquiry, and adventure. And this is what I've tried to capture in the book, the story of the travelers who went out from this fabulous city, which was the first city in the known world in the medieval era to pass the population threshold of 1 million people. These were the people who went out from Baghdad in this golden age to see the world that they thought had just been delivered to them by God.
And so the term golden age, it's one that's used commonly to describe this period. I mean, it's sort of generally seen as a high point in a civilization.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I've described in my book one of the palaces that the great Caliph Harun al-Rashid dwelt in. Harun al-Rashid, who often features as a character in the stories of the 1001 Nights. He lived in a palace that was known as the Qasr al-Khuld, the Palace of Eternity, so known because its gardens were thought to imitate those in heaven. And there were rooms in these palaces which were designed to subtly correspond with the gardens outside. So you would have one visitor describe visiting an audience hall that was decked out in pink silk carpets. The servants were all arrayed in pink silk robes. Then outside there were pink petals being showered down from the apple, peach and pear trees outside. It was that kind of fabulousness was commonly recognized at the time. There's a lovely story as well of a traveler who just left Basra to travel all the way to China to meet the emperor, the Tang emperor of the time. He was an aristocrat and descended from the prophet, so he figured as an aristocrat the emperor would meet him, and he did. And he tells a tale, which might be a little spurious, Kari, where he tells the tale of meeting the emperor of the day and says, "Oh, tell me how you rank the emperors in your land, the land of the Arabs." And he says, "Oh, I don't know if we do that." And the Chinese emperor says, "Well, we rank the emperors like this. There's the emperor, the king of the Turks. There's the king of the Indians. There's me as the emperor of the Chinese, and then above us is the emperor of the Arabs. We commonly acknowledge them as him as the greatest emperor in the world. I can't ever see a Chinese emperor doing that in a million years, Kari. But nonetheless, this is what he reported. He said it was in exchange with the Tang emperor after having travelled all the way to Chang'an to visit him."
It's a lovely story, and I suppose it plays to that idea of empires, the empires that were competing at the time. One of the things I thought we could maybe begin with is the question of how this relates to your, in a sense, other civilizations or the other obsessions that you've had as a writer. I think you once told me that you like your books to shake hands, I think was the expression you used, or in some way to relate or touch. Are there links between this book and your interest in the golden age of Islam and the other writing you've done?
Indeed, Kari, and I'm sure you'll be pleased to note that Iceland gets a slight walk-in role even in this book
I'm
that's centered around
expecting that.
faraway Baghdad.
I'm expecting that in all of your works, Richard, for there to be some reference to Iceland. I think that was in the contract we signed for Sagaland.
I think it was. In this context, it's the story of how the Great Plague, came and decimated two empires. It turns out, and I didn't know this until writing my book on Byzantium, that I since discovered that they believe it was a gigantic volcanic eruption on Iceland, which was not yet populated by anyone other than Catholic priests, I think, at that point, Kari, as you know, that caused a shroud across the earth that created a degree of global cooling, which allowed plague rats to travel up the Nile for the first time from the center of Africa. They arrived in Alexandria, got on board the grain ships at Alexandria, and went out to Constantinople, into Damascus, into all the port cities of the Mediterranean, and destroyed the population. So the Great Plague of Justinian was all Iceland's fault, Kari. I'm sure you're prepared to issue an apology on behalf of all of Iceland for that, and if you do so, it'll be graciously accepted, I'm sure.
So is that
But yes,
any seismic event in Iceland requires an apology now? Is that
I think so. I think that's right. But yes, my books do shake hands. Like in some ways, this is a lovely. I think this current book, is a counterpart to my first book, Ghost Empire,
Mhm.
which was a history of the later Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, as it's called these days. Centered around my travel there with my 14-year-old son, and very much, I think that book was looking on events in the revolution in the Arab world and the creation of the vast Abbasid Empire through the eyes of the Christians of Constantinople. And it's sort of the gaze is reversed in this one. The Arabs arise out of obscurity as this kind of race that was regarded by contempt by the Romans and the Persians. Suddenly, bang, they overrun half the Roman Empire and all of the Sassanid Persian Empire. They have a bigger empire than the Romans ever had. And suddenly we're looking back on Constantinople, back on Byzantium, and on China and on India with the imperial gaze of the Abbasid Caliphate. So they connect in that way. And also, Kari, my third book, The Golden Maze, which was a history of the city of Prague, the earliest description we have of the city of Prague comes from a traveller from the Golden Age of Islam, from Cordoba, a Jewish traveller called Ibn Yaqub, who was on the northern Silk Roads and stopped off in Prague in the 9th century when it was still a pagan city. And he describes the slave markets, the saunas that people used in Prague, the way the city was built. So they all sort of touch each other at various points at some point. And it's all of a piece of me having a kind of a big jigsaw puzzle in my head of that period, the early Middle Ages, which I don't see as a dark age at all. I see this as a period of where the world is reinventing itself. It's certainly a dark age in Western Europe, but everywhere else, in China, in Arabia, in Persia, in Constantinople, it's a time where the pulse starts to quicken, where innovation comes in. New technologies, new ideas arrive. There's an interchange of artistic styles, and there's enormous, fabulous wealth. And this is all taking place between these giant metropolises of Baghdad, Constantinople, Chang'an, and elsewhere at a time when London and Paris were these little muddy backwaters.
Yes, and it's an incredible lesson in perspective, isn't it? In the historical perspective, how, for example, if you look at Constantinople from the perspective of your first book, it's a very different place from the one we see in this one. Um, if we think a little bit then about cities, you mentioned the big, the big cities of the time, and Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age became one of the great cities of the world, and was even referred to, I believe, from your book as the city of peace. Um, what made it, so famous? What made it? What made a city a great city at that time? Was it peaceful? Was it a city of great learning, of great wealth?
It was a purpose-built capital. That's the main thing, I think. There'd been another dynasty of caliphs in power. The first four caliphs were known as the rightly guided ones, the first four successors to the Prophet Muhammad. They were the ones that mastered the conquests. They were followed by the Caliphate of the Umayyad dynasty, which was based in Damascus in Syria. And then there was a revolution in the middle of the 8th century, and a new dynasty took over, the Abbasids. And they didn't want anything to do with the old dynasty, so they wanted to shift the capital. And for not just that reason, they wanted to shift the capital east of Damascus, because the Mediterranean world was not really of such great importance to them anymore. They were looking more east to China, to India, Sri Lanka, to the coastal kingdoms of East Africa, and the Spice Islands. That's where all the money, the action, the population, the culture was. And so the Caliph Mansour went looking for the site for a new purpose-built capital, a Canberra of the Arabs, if you like, Kari. And
That
weirdly enough,
makes it less exciting to me.
well, it does, but not to me, because I lived in Canberra for a while. But it weirdly enough, it only occurred to me when I was talking about this book in Canberra the other night that it is kind of strangely Canberra-like, because it's built on a disc. It's built on
Yeah,
a circle as its guiding principle, which is where the city of peace was. It was called the Round City, the
yeah.
center of Baghdad, and it was Mansour was very keen to place it in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, because for two reasons. One was because this was an extraordinarily fertile place, and he wanted it to be a gigantic Arab Muslim metropolis. And you needed to be able to sustain the population by having it enrich the rich Sawa, the rich black loam floodlands of the Mesopotamian plain for that, but also because it was in the precinct of other great empires, like the ruins of Babylon were just down the river, and
Mm.
also the capital Ctesiphon of the Sassanid Persians was nearby as well, 20 miles down the river, which had been run over by the Arab conquerors, and so they felt like they were in this kind of great zone of greatness, and they took their right place there. And so very quickly, Baghdad became the biggest city in the world, outstripping even Constantinople and Chang'an, and it could sustain this great population. And when Mansour had completed it, he designed it, like I said, with the round city at the center, because he was a fan of Euclid, the Greek mathematician, and so he designed it as a disc with four roads cutting through it diagonally that would lead out with four gates leading out to the world. And he famously stood over the Khorasan gate, I think it was, standing out and looked out and said famously, "Here is the Tigris, and nothing stands between it and China." So it gives you a sense of the focus of the caliphate as a place that would reach out to the rest of the world from the center of that world.
It's wonderful, and of course that's what your book does very beautifully. It reaches out from Baghdad and looks in different directions. Um, and what we end up with is a book that is as much about the encounters between Islam and the rest of the world as it is about Baghdad itself and the caliphate itself. I mean, how important was it to the leaders at this time and to other Islamic people to engage with other cultures? Were they curious about the world? Did they see it as part of their empire, if you like, to look outwards?
On the back cover of my book, there's a quote, and it says quite simply, "Go about the earth and look." And this is a injunction that's often repeated throughout the Holy Book of Islam, the Quran. Again and again, the voice in the Quran says, "Go about the earth and look. Go out, see, travel, find for yourself, see it, go out into the world." And the Prophet Muhammad was famous for having said to his followers once, seek knowledge even as far as China. So it's right there embedded at the heart of the faith to go out into the world. And because the Arab conquest, had been so successful so quickly over such a gigantic era, they really did feel the Son of God on their faces. They felt they'd been blessed by God. They got it right. You know, they had the ideology of Islam, the faith that was approved of by God and which granted them the whole world. And so they felt obliged to go out and travel. They were mad for travel and mad for books and mad for books about travel. So the travelers compiled these vast geographies, these compendious accounts of the great wide world as it was. And one of those was called the Book of Roads and Kingdoms, and that's given me the title for this book. So travel is deeply embedded in the whole culture of that civilization. And I have to say, Kari, that as I was reading their accounts and the way they wrote about the world outside their empire, I was sort of really reminded of the British in the 19th century and the Americans in the 20th century. They won an empire. They were utterly confident they got it right in the way the rest of the world hadn't, that they were an example for the rest of the world to follow. And when they travelled, they did so a bit like the British putting on a pith helmet and a safari suit and a walking stick and going out into the world, curious and interested and engaged and often sympathetic, oftentimes heavily critical, but by and large with that sense of effortless superiority and conscious of the deference they often received as coming from the great imperial power of the day. So it's a way of turning that imperial gaze that the Western world is used to projecting out onto the rest of the world back around upon itself. It's very common for people to be that way, to be chauvinistic about their culture and think they've got it right and that the rest of the world wants to be like them. And that's how they were. And they felt that God had rolled out the carpets of the world for them to travel on. And they did. And they went out and came back and wrote about it in ways that are really quite unusual for that time, Kari, I think. I don't really know of any other culture that was so keen to travel for its own sake. The only people you can think who are remotely like them were the Vikings, of course, in their willingness to travel, to raid, to settle, to do and to plant their flag, if you like, all over the world beyond their shores.
I guess in Viking culture, there was a certain honor and fame that attached to travel and to great deeds abroad. Was that the case at this time as well? Could you gain status by being a well-traveled person? And another question, I suppose, is were you traveling as a representative of Islam when you traveled, or was it individualistic as well, say in the way that medieval Scandinavian culture was perhaps more individualistic than it was the behavior of emissaries or diplomats? What was the
Yes.
situation in the culture you describe here?
It's very different. And yes, the Scandinavian culture is much more individualistic. Like, I, Eric the Red, went to Green. I did this and I came back. It's not quite so much like that. There are also injunctions to humility. And very often these are traders who are not going out as conquerors. The conquests are all done and dusted pretty early on. So when they go out into the world, they're going out often as traders or as the servants of the caliph on diplomatic missions. So they're the people who are going out into the world, or they're scientists. They don't really have that kind of dream of conquest about them. Having said that, one of the most amusing and delightful things I've found is that the ghost of Alexander the Great kept popping up again and again. Now, Alexander the Great had been dead for nearly 1,000 years, I think, by the time the caliphate came into existence. But his name still rang out across the centuries. And his name obsessed Julius Caesar, as we know. There's a wonderful anecdote about Julius Caesar in Roman times, reading Aaron's account of the exploits of Alexander the Great while stationed as the proconsul in Spain. And this is before he becomes dictator of Rome. And he was found weeping, reading the exploits of Alexander the Great, saying, by the age I am at the moment, Alexander the Great was dead. And here I am sitting in Spain, an outpost, as a mere governor, and my hair's thinning, and it's just pathetic. And he wept for himself and his failure to attain Alexander's glory. But his glory was about to come, still yet to come to him. And I find again in these traveller's tales the story of the Caliph Watik, who sends out Salam the interpreter to go to the Badlands in the northeast of the world. He's weeping because he can't live the life of Alexander the Great. I find stories of the mythical exploits of Alexander the Great popped up again and again in the world of Islam, and there are depictions of him in artwork where he's depicted as a Middle Eastern figure with a turban, and where he appears in the Quran as the builder of the wall of Gog and Magog in the far east of the world. And so he sort of haunts the book throughout, and even up to the 20th century. One of the figures I have in the book who comes in from the 20th century, an archaeologist called Sir Mark Orrell Stone, spent his life trying to follow in Alexander's footsteps in a scholarly way, not as a conqueror, obviously. So there isn't that individualistic culture there. And I think they're a bit more like the Christians of Constantinople. When they have a great victory, they don't go, I did this, I. They go, thanks be to God. They say, thanks be to God all the time. And so it's a different kind of culture there, I think, to the pagan Vikings of the time.
And it sounds also like a culture that valued action. I remember reading somewhere in the book you talked about that Islam was a religion of actions and of doing things rather than one that was, as focused as Christianity on theological debates. And so that, I suppose, that was a motivation for people to do great things in something like the way that Alexander was perceived as doing.
Yes, I felt I had to try and understand the appeal of Islam. When the Arab armies conquered their empire, they often arrived in places like Egypt, kicked out the Romans out of Egypt, and they arrived as a tiny minority of believers in a large community, a very old one, populated mainly by Christians, Coptic Christians and other kinds of Christians, Orthodox Christians, and they absolutely did not indulge in religious persecution, and it would have been stupid of them to do so. They cut this kind of a deal once they took over a conquered province. They said to the conquered peoples, you must accept the caliph as your political master, but we will not force you to become Muslims by any means. If you accept him peacefully and you pay a special tax, a jizya, as an infidel for people of the book, like Jews and Christians, you can have your churches, you can have your synagogues, we will not molest you, we will not seize your property, you can go and worship your God peacefully, we will not interfere with you. And so that was very wise in the long run, because it coaxed people towards Islam. It made people interested. And of course, Islam was, the religion of power in the era. So many people, if they wanted to get on, were happy to convert to Islam or adopt Islam. Zoroastrianism just declined massively in Iran as Islam picked up speed. And a lot of the great bureaucrats of what had been the Persian culture of the time, who had been Zoroastrians or Buddhists, dropped their faith, adopted Islam, and came to Baghdad and became the managers of the new empire. But again, there wasn't this widespread persecution of non-believers at the time. They were happy for people to arrive at their own accord. In fact, given the system that there was a tax in place on the non-believers, this was an incentive for caliphs to have people not convert to Islam. And there are several occasions where the caliphs go, just ease up a bit on the conversions, will you? Because the revenue stream we're getting here is quite nice. And because there was this lack of coercion, it meant that when people did adopt Islam, they did it of their own choice by and large, and they did so, and it meant it was more deeply embedded in these areas. And so, as a result, Egypt has been eventually became predominantly Islamic, and now very much so over time. So it was a very slow building thing, and Islam. One of the reasons for its appeal, as you say, was that it's very doable. One of the reasons why a lot of people found it appealing was it didn't invite its followers or demand its followers to conduct a lot of soul searching and the relentless search for whether you have sin in your heart. Christianity sets a high moral bar in it. It asks for extraordinary levels of compassion. It asks, for you to treat your neighbour as you treat yourself. And that's a very, very hard thing for people to do, and a very honourable thing to ask of them. But Islam said, don't forget about the theological hair splitting about the nature of whether God can be one and three at the same time. God can be all the one thing and also yet the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Forget all that. God is one and indivisible. That's it. There is no God but God, and excuse me, and Muhammad is his messenger. And it says you want to be an upright person, you follow the 5 pillars of Islam about giving alms to the poor, pausing for prayer 5 times a day, observing fasting during daylight hours during Ramadan, and so on and so on and so on, and conduct a pilgrimage. But very reasonably, Islam also had these ways out. Like, it wasn't totalitarian in its requests. Like it said, if you're an able-bodied person, you must perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, once in your lifetime. But if you're too poor or infirm and you can't travel, that's fine. You're off the hook. During Ramadan, people are expected to fast during daylight hours, but pregnant women and sick people who need to eat during daylight hours, they're off the hook as well. So it's all very doable. And I think that's one of the reasons for its mass appeal at the time, Kari.
Typically, empires need to discover limits as well as, points of expansion. Was there anywhere that the caliphate, sort of didn't want to go, or where they discovered that they'd gone far enough? Were they perhaps shocked by the Northerners, or I suppose China as well? Was that a point at which there seemed to be a natural but a geopolitical end to the expansion?
Yes, once you get out to Central Asia, there are some natural geographical barriers in place there that seem to draw a kind of an easy line between the caliphate, or the reach of Islam, and the Chinese Empire as it was then. They're based around the mountain ranges that enclose the Taklamakan Desert, and the Hindu Kush in the south as well. So there was kind of a natural border, and after having this kind of headlong race into territory, after a century or so, once it reached a certain point in the settled areas of Central Asia before you get towards the deserts, there was this kind of feeling that although ideologically they really should have kept on going so far and no further. And really, you got to a point, I think, by the late 8th century, where the empire was so big, it was too big for anyone in the medieval world, any power, to run it effectively from a capital. And almost as soon as it was established with these vast geographic parameters, it started to flake off at the edges pretty quick. And there were breakaway emirates led by breakaway dynasties very quickly in North Africa, and most famously in Spain. The last of the Umayyad princes escaped to Spain and established the Emirate of Cordoba in Spain, which itself had an Islamic golden age that almost rivaled that in Baghdad. It was so impressive. So I think there's only so far in that world that empires can expand. And later on in the 13th century, the Mongols found the same thing. They expanded lickety-split right across the Eurasian continent into China, and then it wasn't sustainable in the long run.
Yeah. If we could talk for a moment, Richard, about the writing of this book and how you approached it. The structure is essentially, I think, geographical. You move in different directions, following the encounters that the Islamic world had with other parts of Europe and the East, and also the South. I mean, the expansion and the touch points are incredible, and the amount of information and the number of stories is also kind of fantastical in a way. How did you kind of pull all that together? How did you, if this was a puzzle that you were putting together, was there a way that you made it make sense for yourself?
Yes, during this is my COVID book, and I wrote it during COVID. I had plans to write another book entirely, which would have required me to travel to that place, but I couldn't go. So I thought we'll travel through time rather than space and go to a place that no one can go to, which is a city that no longer exists, which is medieval Baghdad. And as soon as I started burrowing into it, I found, to my shame and surprise, that I'd imagined that the records would be scant and not much in translation. And oh my God, that's completely wrong. The chroniclers of the Golden Age of Islam were very present. They wrote the most voluminous histories of the time, more so even than the Chinese. I think it has to be said, the Tang Dynasty Chinese annals. Like it's so impressive. There's a mountain of history written by contemporary chroniclers and scholars, historians, and it's good history too. It's really history of. I think it's the highest quality history of written in anywhere in the Middle Ages. Thoroughgoing, skeptical in places, not skeptical in others, unfortunately. There's some tales of wonder here and there, but I found this mountain of material, and then I thought to organise it. I just need look no further than the map of Baghdad as it was founded, and you see, like I said, it's a disc with 4 gates on the cardinal points. So I looked at travellers then just out of the various gates of Baghdad going north, south, east, and west, and I found compelling tales of these travellers, these diplomats, soldiers, traders, going north, south, east, and west out of Baghdad into the furthest reaches of the known world of the time, going out to the wall of Gog and Magog in China, into east. That was the eastern chapter. The north chapter was the most harrowing, the voyage of Ibn Fadlan up into Russia, where he witnessed a Viking funeral and a Viking human sacrifice. And the voyages of other traders who went down across the Indian Ocean from the kingdoms of East Africa, and even some evidence of some of the Abbasid traders, Islamic traders in Australia, Kari. Some coins found on a beach off the coast of Arnhem Land. So I organised it on those 4 gates and then ended it with an apocalypse, which is the destruction of the city at the hands of the Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, in 1258.
It's incredible. And I suppose if I were to flatter you for a moment, Richard, I would say that, or praise the work of the book, I would say that what you do really wonderfully well is doesn't quite sound like a compliment, but it really is digress. Like, you allow yourself, for example, when you're in Europe, following the Islamic travels in Europe, to spend time with Charlemagne and to shift for a moment to there and then come back to the central narrative. And I think that's a very difficult thing to manage, but you do so expertly. And I think the patchwork quality that results is rather like a book of treasures. Is that something that you were conscious of doing, like creating this book of interwoven treasures?
Absolutely, Kari. I'm glad you've picked up on that. As you know, I've taken my book from a book title from a geography written in the Golden Age of Islam called The Book of Roads and Kingdoms. But the really outstanding book that I drew upon was by this wonderful scholar called al-Masudi, who was the best travelled man of his time, who'd been all over the known world, from China to Africa to Europe to the north to everywhere. And he wrote this wonderful book called, and it has their books have these lovely titles. His book was called Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. So the books were written often with those kinds of titles. There's another book called The Book of Gifts and Rarities. There's a sense that they've just gathered these stories and facts and information like precious gems and gathered them together and put them in a book. And I love that feeling of, I reading other people's books, when I have that feeling that I've found this little treasury, that should feel like a literal treasury of gems and gold and the like I used to feel reading The 1001 Nights when I was a kid. That idea that these pages can contain treasure is really, really important. It's something I really wanted the book to have that feel like I had from reading Masudi and Ibn Khaldun as well. These other wonderful authors from the Golden Age of Islam, and whom I pay great tribute to in the acknowledgements.
We're really nearly out of time, but you mentioned 1001 Nights, and perhaps we could finish our conversation there. You begin the book with a tale from 1001 Nights, and you end it. And in a way, these are not sort of representative of the historically factual nature of the work as a whole. But was this a desire for the magical elements to be present as well, including?
Yes, indeed, very much so. When Imperial Baghdad was destroyed like I said, in 1258 by Hulagu Khan's armies, utterly and totally destroyed. It was an apocalypse. It really was dreadful. The accounts there are several different accounts I've drawn on for it of people who were there and witnessed the horror of it. The Caliph at the time was impertinent in the eyes of Hulagu Khan, and as a result, he razed the city to the ground and had all of its inhabitants murdered. Those who were found hiding in the rubble, he sent soldiers back some weeks later to see them come out, and then he had those people killed. It was really a totalizing nightmare of an apocalypse on the city. It's really a terrible thing that happened there. But I discovered that from my reading that as Baghdad, the glory of Imperial Baghdad was being utterly annihilated, something else was happening in Cairo. Cairo had by then superseded Baghdad as the center of bookshops and intellect and intellectual venture in the Arabic world. And it was around this time that the stories of the Thousand and One Nights, which had originated in India, picked up more stories from Persia, and of course had been shifted to Baghdad as their central location. It was then, at the same time of the destruction of Baghdad, that the stories of the Thousand and One Nights really sort of cohered into their present form. And so many of them are centered around Baghdad, this magical city of the Golden Age. So even though the physical Baghdad was being destroyed, at the same time, Baghdad was being transformed, like Constantinople, into an immortal city of the imagination that exists in our minds still. I think nearly all of us have that picture of Baghdad in our head. And perhaps it's a little childish, perhaps it's got flying carpets and Aladdin and the like, and all those sorts of things, but it's not really so childish because it's also delightful. Baghdad is a city of wonders. Baghdad is a city of endless wealth. Baghdad is a city of peace and enormous beauty. So the real Baghdad was destroyed. That Baghdad was destroyed. But we still in our minds have this perfect, immortal image of Baghdad at its height. And we have it forever because of the Thousand and One Nights.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. It's been so lovely to speak to you and to talk to you about your Book of Wonders. I've been chatting to Richard Fidler about the Book of Roads and Kingdoms, which is available through Booktopia, of course, and so is The Sorrow Stone, my own book. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Kari.